Hey everyone, welcome back to No Code Buffs, where we help you master no-code tools and automation. And today I'm going to be showing you how to create fully functional tables in bubble.io with CRUD operations and filtering. So we are going to be focusing on CRUD operations, which are essentially giving the user the ability to create, delete, update, and read the data within our app, right? So if we look at this table, we have the actions here where the user is able to edit and delete the data. We have an add new button. And filtering specifically is not a CRUD operation, but we're also going to be taking a look at how we can include filtering in our tables inside bubble.io. So for our example, I'm going to be creating a simple table of expenses where we will have the fields expense name, expense amount, date, and category. And the category could be rent, food, utilities, etc. So now let's go to Bubble and start creating our expenses database. So let's start with the expense table, and we're going to be adding the fields expense name, which will be a text field, the amount, which will be a number, a date, which will be a date type. And now for my category, I want the users to be able to select from a dropdown, so they can choose different categories if they want to for different expenses. So for this, I'm going to be adding a option set called category. And I'll add a few examples here, such as food, home, gas, software, and groceries, for example. And now I can come back here to my data types and find the user table. I can create a new field category, and we'll map this field to the category option set that we've just created. So now we have our expense table configured. Let's go to the design tab and take a look how we can create our table here in the UI. Let's search for the table element and drag and drop that to our page. And the first thing that we have to do is to configure the type of content. So in our case, we want to select expense, right? We want to be able to have a table that lists all the expenses that we have in our database. So the data source will be do a search for expenses, right? So this will search for all the expenses in our database. Now let's take a look at the table styling options that we have here. First, let me remove the fit width to content so the table extends all the way to the other side of the page. And let me add a couple of more columns that we'll need. Tables are really interesting elements in Bubble because they have different features than repeating groups, but in some ways they function as repeating groups as well. So what's interesting here is that the first row of this table will be our header, and we can choose this header to be sticky if we come here to appearance and check make this row sticky, and we can change the background to another color just so we differentiate the header from the data in our table. Now, what I'm going to do is to select all the columns, and I will be applying a padding to the left of 24. And I'm going to do the same with row 1. What's also interesting here in the table is that row 1 is essentially the first element of our repeating group, right? So if we configure row 1, we don't have to worry about the other rows. It functions as a repeating group. So I've added the padding here on my row 1 as well. So now let's start adding text so we can complete our header. Let's place a text here. I will center that vertically, and I'll also increase the weight to 500, and I'm going to start adding the name. So the first column will be called expense name, and we can simply copy and paste this text into the other columns. The second one will be amount. Third one, date. Fourth one, category. And the last one, we can call it action. So in this last column, I want to be able to add a couple of icons that we can use for our CRUD operations. Now we can do the same for the first row. Let me copy and paste this text and change the weights to 400. And I'll copy and paste this one into the other columns. Not the last one, since we'll add the icons here. So our table will display expenses in each row. So we have to configure this dynamic data here in our first row of the table. So the first column will be current row's expense name. The second one will be amount, so I'll add a $sign before the value. So it will be current rows expense amount. This one will be date, and I'll format it as October 11th, 2024. This one will be category display, since it is an option set. And for the icons, let me add a hero icon here in action. I'll make it 20 width, 20 pixels in height, and I'll vertically align this. So my first one will be a pencil for editing the data. And my second one here will be a trash, so we can delete the data. I'll make these icons grouped into a row container, so elements are side by side. I remove them in height, and I'll add some spacing in between of 12 pixels. Now, finally, for the design, let's configure the table itself, where we can come here on appearance, and I will remove the vertical separators, and I'll add some border to it around this 10, and let me make the border a gray color. So what I want to do now is to create a button where we can add data to this table. Now what I'll do here is to add a group on top of my table, and I'm going to remove the fit width to content, and I'm going to add two things here. I'm going to add my title, and I'm going to add a button so we can add more data to the table. I'll make this group, let me call this group header, and let me make it layout row, so elements are side by side. And I'll click here on space between and container alignment, so each element goes to one side. Let me make the title of this table expense table, and I'll make it height 24 and semi-bold, which looks good. Let me vertical align this to the bottom, and now let me add a label to my button of add expense. So when a user clicks on add expense, I want to open a pop-up so the user can input the data, and then we can save it to our table. So let's add our pop-up now, and I'll make it max width of 450, and I'll remove fit width to content, and I'll add padding of 24 pixels to each side. I'll add a title to my pop-up, which will be expense. We'll make it 24 as well, semi-bold, and I'll apply some gap spacing of 24 between each element of my pop-up, and now I can start creating my inputs. So I can add a text. My first input will be expense name, and it will be a text input, so I can drag and drop that here. I'll make these two components into a column container. I'll add some spacing between them of 6 pixels. I'll remove fit width to content of both the group and also the input. So my input's going to be a text format, and this is going to be called input expense name. Now I want this title to be 500 in weight. Good. So I can copy and text this input for configuring my other inputs. So expense name, the second one will be amount. And now this input will be formatted as currency. I'll copy and paste this again, and then we can configure our date. Let me add a name to my amount input, which will going to be input amount. Let me go back to dates now. And this one, I want to replace it by a date and time picker. And I can do standard style here. And now I'm going to copy and paste this again. And now we can choose our category. And now I'm going to replace this date and time picker by a drop down. A drop down will also be standard style. I want the options to be dynamic, and I want the options to be the options on the option set category. So the option caption will be display, so we can see the name of the option here. And lastly, let me rename this to input category. And lastly, I want to add my buttons of creating expense and canceling as well. So let me add a button and let me make it outlined, and this will be my cancel button. Now let me add my primary button, which will be add expense. Let me group these elements into row container, remove the fixed width. And now for both of them, I'm going to remove the fixed width again. And for the group that they're in, I'm going to apply some gap spacing, some column gap spacing of 12, right? So we have our pop-up here where the user will be able to fill this in and add more data to the table. So now let's configure the workflow for this. So first, when the user clicks on the cancel button, I simply want to close this pop-up. I'll name this pop-up expense. So it's easier to find this. So let's add a workflow to the button cancel, where we'll simply hide the pop-up expense. And now when we click on add expense, we want to create a new record on our table. So what I want to do is to go to data, create new thing. We're going to be creating a new expense, and we're going to be configuring all the fields. So amount, we'll choose input amounts value. Category, we have a input category. It's actually a drop down. Input category. Okay, it's just named input. Let me change this to drop down category. Now date will be our date time picker. And now our expense name will be the input expense name. And what we also want to do is to reset the inputs. And now we want to hide our pop-up as well. So pop-up expense, we're going to be hiding that as well. So let's get out of this pop-up now. And what we also want to do here is to add a workflow to this button, add expense, right? So when the user clicks here, we want to be able to show the pop-up expense. I believe we're at a good point where we can preview this and try adding expenses to this table to see how it looks like. So let's go ahead and do that right now. Okay, so the table looks like this. Let me configure the height of these rows. So I want to make the header fixed height of maybe 65. And I also want to do a fixed height for the first row, which will configure all the other rows as well of 65. Let's see how that looks now. I think it will be a little bit better. So we don't have anything on our table. When we click add expense, we should be able to see the pop-up. And let's try adding an expense now. So Starbucks, let me do 7.5. I bought the coffee today, and that's going to be category food. So when we add the expense now, we should be able to see that on the table. Great. So now let's work on the editing and deleting functionality. Let's go back to our editor. And what we want to do now is to, whenever we click on the pencil icon, we want to open that pop-up again, but we want that pop-up to display the data that is within this row, right? It is an expense record on our database. So what we want to do now is to configure our pop-up to be able to handle this. If we open our pop-up expense and we click on it, we will be able to see here the type of content. So we can set the type of content to expense. And now if we click here, let's make this group here that we have both the icons and expense as well. So it's able to read the data from this row. And let's make the data source current rows expense, right? So now if we add a workflow to this pencil icon, what we want to do here is to click on element actions and then do a display data. And we're going to choose our pop-up expense, and we're going to send the data that is within this row to the pop-up. So we can click here on current rows expense. And then we can also open the pop-up, right? Now, whenever the pop-up has a data source, we have to configure these inputs here to be able to show the data that is within this pop-up, right? So you want to configure all of these groups to be type of content expenses. And now for each of the inputs, right, you want to have for this group now, actually, we need to set the data source, which will be parents group expense. And now for this input, what I want to do here is to choose parent group's expense name. So when this pop-up has a data source, it will show here the expense name of this data source in this input. When the pop-up doesn't have any data attached to it, then it's not going to show anything, right? We can do the same here for the other fields as well. This will be amount. Let's set this group data source to parents group expense. This will be initial content, date. And now same for category. This will be parents group expense. And now the input itself, the default value will be parents group expense category. Right? So now we actually need to change the workflow that we've added to the expense button, right? Because now we need to differentiate when the pop-up has some data attached to it and when the pop-up does not, right? So let's click on the edit workflow for this button as well, the button expense. And we want this to happen here. We want to create a new expense only when we can find this pop-up here now, which is pop-up expense, only when its data source is empty. So when pop-up expense is empty, we want to be creating a new expense, right? So let me color code this so it's easy to find later. And now let me copy and paste the same workflow and change the conditions here. So when pop-up expense is not empty, what do I want to do now? So now I don't want to create a new expense. I simply want to edit the expense that we already have. So instead of creating a new expense, I will choose data, make changes to thing, right? And I will choose these buttons here. Let's configure the group data source as well. So this will be expense, and then the data source will be parents group expense. And so when the expense is not empty, right, we want to make changes to thing. We want to choose the parents group expense, right? And we want to be able to change the fields, right? So we're going to write to these fields again. So drop down category, the date time picker for date, and then the expense name. Input expense name. Right, so we want to edit this data, we want to reset relevant inputs, and now what we also want to do is to reset the data of this pop-up. Pop-up expense, we can reset the data. Now let's go ahead and try this out. So what I want to do now is to edit this Starbucks expense that we've added. So if I click here on the pen icon, I should see the pop-up with the expense that we just clicked, right? So we have Starbucks. And now let me change 7.5 to $10.20. And if we click add expense, then it should update the data record that we have. We can do something here on the pop-up as well, which is text here can be, for example, new expense. And we can set a condition here to say when the pop-up expense data source is not empty, the text can be edit expense. And we can do the same here for this button, add expense, right? So let me copy this conditional expression. If we click here on conditional expression and paste, when pop-up expense data source is not empty, we want the label to be edit expense, right? So let's preview this again. If we click on add expense, we should see new expense, add expense. Let's add a new one. So let's do a Costco amount, $100 yesterday, and category food. Let's add this expense here, right? Now, if I want to edit this Costco expense, if I click here, now we can see edit expense, edit expense. I can change this to, let's change the date, for example, to October 6th, right? So it changed. Great. So now what's left for us to do with the CRUD operations is to work on the delete operation. So we can delete the data within our table. So let's go ahead to the UI again. And I want to be able to create a similar pop-up from the expense pop-up. But now I just want to be able to confirm if the user actually wants to delete that piece of data, right? We don't want the user to click here on the trash icon and delete the data by mistake. So what I want to do now is to copy and paste this pop-up expense, right? I want to delete the inputs and the conditional expressions. And I just want to say something simple like, are you sure? And let me remove the min height here. So now, are you sure? The user is either going to cancel and then it's going to close the pop-up. Let's call this pop-up delete. And now this button will remove the conditionals again, and the label will be delete, right? And keep in mind that this pop-up also has the data source of expense, right? So when we click on the trash icon, you want to send this expense to this pop-up so it knows what it needs to delete, right? So let's configure the workflows for this pop-up, right? So if the user clicks cancel, we are going to be hiding the pop-up delete. And now if the user clicks delete, what we want to do is to come here to data delete thing. And now let's find the pop-up delete expense, right? It's the data source of the pop-up delete. And now we want to hide this pop-up again, right? And the last thing that we have to configure is to show the pop-up whenever the user clicks on the trash icon. So if the user clicks on the trash icon, I want to configure the workflow. And what we want to do is to display the data on the pop-up delete. And the data will be the parent group expense. And now what we want to do is to show the pop-up delete, right? So let's try this again and see if that works. So let's click on the trash icon. We should see the pop-up. And now if we click delete, it should delete our entry from the table. So now we've completed our CRUD operations. We have add, edit, and delete data. And read is just what we're seeing here in the screen, right? We're able to read and see the data in our table. So now, last thing that we want to do is to add a filter here. And so let's add a filter for category. I will be placing a drop down next to our add expense button. Let me add this drop down here to the header, and let me group these two components in a row container, and let me add some gap spacing between them of column of 12. Right, so now I want to have the options of the category options on my drop down, so I'm able to choose them. And what we want to do is to have dynamic choices. Our option set category. We want to see all the options, and now we want to see their names, right? So I'm going to call this drop down category filter. And what we can do is to filter on the data source of this table, right? So if we click here, the data source is simply we're searching for all of the expenses. And now to add a filter, we can click here on top of expenses and add a new constraint, right? So my constraint will be on the category field, which will be the category is equal to my drop-down category filter, right? And I want to check here, ignore empty constraints, which means that if there's nothing here on my filter drop-down, my table is just going to display the list of expenses without filtering. So let's try this out now. Preview this again, and we'll see our records here. Let me change Costco to a new category. Let's say groceries, for example. And now let's try to filter this table by groceries. We should only be able to see Costco here because it's the only entry that is on category groceries. Now, if we change it to food, now we're able to see Starbucks. And if we change it to blank, for example, now we're able to see all the records here, right? If I add another grocery expense, let's do Safeway, amount 120, and date and category groceries, right? So now we have two grocery entries, and if we filter by groceries, we should be able to see these two entries. Now, what I've also noticed here is that the newest items on our table are on the bottom of the table, and I want to change this real quickly. So what I want to do here is on the data source of our table, I want to click here on expense again, and I want to sort by creation date. And I want to have the sorting to be descending, right? So that way, the newest items that we added, so Safeway was the last one, should be on top. Okay, so I know we've covered a lot today, but we've reached the end of the video. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like button below. And if you're interested in more no-code tips, tutorials, and app building strategies, just make sure to subscribe and click the bell icon below so you never miss a new video. And as always, feel free to drop any questions below or any feedbacks that you have about my videos. I'd be happy to hear you guys and interact with all of you. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.